Excellent. So thank you to Freelancer and StartCon for inviting us to present here. And thank you also for braving the cold on a chilly Thursday evening to actually come down and listen to some startup accountants and lawyers about managing your staff a bit more effectively. So we're going to talk about a topic which is pretty close to the situations that we see every day at Fullstack, and that is managing the cap tables a bit more effectively. Because as founders, we can only go so far with hustling and working till 9 to 5, or more like 5 to 9. But we also have to bring on other people onto the cap table as well, particularly if you want to go far and potentially reach an exit. So we're going to talk about some of the tools that we can use to onboard employees and investors more effectively to our cap table, which means we're going to cover sweat equity, ESOPs, and ESIC in a bit more detail. In particular, avoiding any of the tax missteps that founders tend to cross, as well as some of the legalities, which Doron, my friend, will cover in more detail. Feel free to, we'll have a question after the session, so we'll leave the questions till then. But just so we can tailor the presentation a bit more to your liking, it would be good to get a show of hands for who's the founder in the room. Great, so it's Founderville here. Is there any investors in the room as well? Just a few. Well, we've got some information here for you as well, and particularly around ESIC, so stay tuned. So a bit about us. I'm Stuart Reynolds, I'm a chartered accountant. I found this firm called Fullstack Advisory, which helps essentially founders to get to the next level of their venture. We've had plenty of success to date. We've over 200 clients, and some of those startups have gone on to raise many millions in cash, not from just investors, but also from the government as well. Cool. So let's talk about onboarding the employees more effectively. So has anybody here actually issued employee option plans before? Okay, so there's a lot of newbies here in the room. And ESOPs are not so much big in Australia, but they are progressively becoming so. But they are big time popular in the States. And why so? Well, it helps your employees to think more like a founder. You'll start seeing less bickering around salary increases, around bonuses, and more about how can we make our staff much more valuable. And there's also the issue of actually competing for talent. You might have encountered, say, Google or Facebook pinching potential developers from your firm or startup. Or not yet. But the reality is there. Google and Facebook, they've got the salaries, they've got the perks. But as founders, you need all the brains that you can get towards your exit, which on average for most founders takes to 7 to 10 years. But the average tenure of most developers is mostly 2 to 3 years, right? So we've got to try and compete on our own end. And that's why we enter the ESOP. It allows us to take our bootstrapping salary and make it much more appealing to founders that may join our venture. It allows your staff to basically align their goals better with your company. It gets them to think more about the long term for what they're contributing to your startup. But it's also a lot cheaper as well. Less recruitment fees, less turnover, less training. So textbook definition of ESOP, it's an employee share option plan. And the big upswing for employees is that whilst now we can get the grant based on current pricing, if we constantly contribute value to the startup and later see an exit, we're going to see a whole big unrealised value there when we sell. It also promotes bigger picture thinking. So there's less discussions around how can I make my team look the best or how can I get the biggest salary increase. It's more like how can I increase the value of my startup. And it's not just our opinion, it's also, there's heaps of case studies behind it where employee-owned companies, they produce a lot more value than the traditional corporate way. And there's this big study in Europe where employee-owned businesses outdid the SP 500 by almost double in terms of return on investment over time. Now, ESOPs didn't always used to be as rosy. Before July 15, founders were giving out employee shares in startups, but these actually carried a tax bill as well. And if you've got shares in a startup, you don't necessarily have the liquidity as, say, BHP shares. That meant a lot of these were getting just cast aside. Then we enter the startup concessions brought in by Malcolm T and his government. And this allowed the employees to essentially defer their tax obligations until they sold their shares. So the proceeds from the sale could be used to pay the tax man. Not only that, we could also count the period that we held the options for towards the 12-month period for the 50% discount. So we also deal with a lot of employees of startups as well. And what we see these employees doing is allocating their options to a family trust. Now, this is quite good for asset protection. You're keeping aside your startup situation from your personal situation. But also, when you sell, you may have the opportunity to distribute the income out to different parties, be it yourself and your partner. But this is a bit of a pro tip here. You can't actually consider the period that you held the options for in that 12-month consideration. So the advice here is just to exercise your options at least 12 months before a sale, so you can get that extra 50% discount. All right. So there's a bit more considerations in an ESOP. They're not as widely understood as, say, just receiving shares in a company. And employees may feel that they can't influence the share price as much. This is more or less just a piece around education. There's also a lot more to administer with an ESOP, and you have to tackle it from a freeway approach, from both chatting to your lawyer, chatting to your accountant, but also making sure that the tax is accounted for correctly. So I've mainly just discussed the option plans, but the reality is you can also have a ESS as well. And we've got some basic differences here, which Doron will cover in more detail. But essentially, options, they're not shares. You're not giving them voting rights to the company. You're not giving them dividends just yet. They have to be exercised before that happens. And I'll let Doron cover the rest of them. So, to get eligibility for the startup concessions, there's a few hoops that we have to jump through. First off is this whole bunch of concessions which entail the general ESS rules. So first off, we have to make sure that we're issuing these to employees or directors of the company. These have to be relating to ordinary shares. So forget any ESSs with, say, redeemable preference shares. And when you give the shares or options to the employees, they can have a maximum of 10% for shareholding and voting.
Is that per employee or
Total, yeah. For startups, it's a lot easier. Just don't list on the ASX. Make sure you have a turnover aggregated less than 50 million. You have to be incorporated less than a decade and based here in Australia. Then we come out all the way to the third criteria, which is more around the legalities, around what is entailed in your ESOP offer plan. Included in that offer is the requirement to hold these interests for at least 3 years, or from when you cease employment with the company. This last point here around ASIC, it often gets forgotten about advisors, but it is a requirement nonetheless by ASIC. If you're issuing shares, they basically want you to report this to them, unless it's issued to senior managers or the total value per employee is less than 5,000. Okay, and there's this final requirement around basically issuing your interests at not more than market value. Now, market value in startups, it's a topsy-turvy turn because valuations are quite like a roller coaster. So the ATO thankfully brought sense to the situation by bringing in the safe harbour methodology. And what this allows us to do is basically take our very basic startup balance sheet, in particular the assets of your company, say cash versus plus fixed assets, less any liabilities, which is usually the amounts that we have to pay the ATO. And this usually results in an NTA of practically next to nothing in most cases, which means the employee doesn't have to pay very much to the founders to get on board this special concession. That said, there are some requirements by the ATO to apply this valuation. First off, we have to be a startup, per the previous slide. And there also can't be a change of control in the following 6 months. So if you're anticipating a takeover of your startup, this probably isn't for you. You also can't have any big raises in the 12 months prior. So if you've just done a Series A, maybe not. You can't have been around for more than 7 years operation as well. Okay, so we've talked mainly about the ATO, but the reality is that Revenue New South Wales wants their cut as well. So we have to consider how this interacts with payroll tax. And they give us 2 different days to calculate the benefit that we have to include it in our calculation. We can either choose the grant day, where our startup is usually not as worth as much as, say, the vesting day, where there's usually a few more runs on the board and the startup is worth a lot more. So if you have an option to choose the grant day or vesting day, please choose the grant day. But if you're unlucky, you have to choose the vesting date. And Revenue New South Wales, they give us either the day your shares are vested, essentially, or the options are exercised, or failing that, 7 days after the shares are granted. How much to declare? Well, this is basically the unpaid portion of what you've given to the employee. So we would take the value as calculated per the relevant day, less anything that was contributed by the employee in this interest. And we see a lot of startups, they're just on that threshold of maybe, say, 600,000, and then we have the big vesting day, and then there's a massive obligation for payroll tax. So you need to start including this in if you're planning moving forwards, if you're not already paying payroll tax. This is where we report our what we're doing to the ATO. And the ATO wants to be told via an ESS statement, which is lodged before 14th of July. We've seen quite a few startup employees not actually receive this. And what this is doing is causing a lot of problems when they're trying to calculate their capital gains after the sale of their shares or options. So be a good founder and definitely get this stuff out to the ATO and your employees before 14th of July. Okay, so we've got some happy employees. They've got their ESOPs, great. But the reality is we may need some investment as well. So this is where we cover this this topic called ESIC. And I've chatted with many founders, and this always seems to be a new topic of interest and intrigue to them, because this isn't actually well educated through the media. But let's cover it. Now, it's a great government incentive, perhaps even globally, to encourage investment in early stage startups. Now, you may have seen this. This is the funding cycle, right? Where there's often a valley of death during that seed phase, where you only have, say, angels and family, friends and fools funding you. But the government saw that there was a gap here, and they sought to incentivize more investors towards hardcore innovation. So they brought out this ESIC, and what it does is allow the investor a 20% tax offset for the amount of their investment. And it also allows a reduced CGT outcome for the next 10 years of the investment. This is basically the ATO putting out a big bat signal. Invest now, right? Cool. So how do we qualify as a startup? The first stage is rather easy. We simply have to have less than 200K revenue, have less than $1 million in expenses. We have to be incorporated, and we also have to be unlisted. Now, most startups, they can pass that quite easily if they're early stage. Then we look at the second stage of tests, which is not as straightforward. First off, we had the 100-point innovation test, which is, you may think of it, say, almost like a 100-point ID test. You just present the right documents or events to the ATO and you're eligible. Failing that, you may also be eligible per the principles-based innovation test, which is a bit more subjective. So, the 100-point innovation test. If you receive the Accelerating Commercialisation grant, congratulations, you've won the lotto. you're 3/4 of the way there. If you've done R&D, you're at least another half of the way there as well. Okay. If you've done the accelerator program, there's another half of your points. And failing that, you may have received a patent, you may have worked with the university, or even issued 50K of shares to a third party. Now, for the startups that aren't necessarily spending so much on R&D, we had to file for this principles-based innovation test. And it's basically us showing the ATO with examples how we meet all these 5 criteria. So are we innovating a product that is going to be sold to a third party? Does our startup have high growth potential? Is our startup scalable? Most software startups are, because they've got a high hockey stick growth with the income, whilst their expenses aren't increasing as much. They can also address a national and global market. And ideally, you want to have competitive advantage versus your peers. Now, because this is so subjective, we see a lot of advisors and even VCs actually recommending a private ruling just to provide other people in the round more comfort. Okay, so as a startup, we've found that we're eligible, but that's only one half of the story. Your investors also have to be eligible as well. And there's many different ways that your investor can disqualify themselves from the ESIC. So if you're an investor and you received transfer shares from a founder, you've struck yourself out. If you're an investor and you're getting an ESOP, struck out again. You also can't be a large corporate and get the ESIC as well. So that's that requirement. If you're a sophisticated investor, you don't have this next requirement, but if you're a retail investor, which is most people in this room, you can't invest more than 50K in a startup. We've had people who have invested, say, 50K in 1 year through a safe note and then another 40K in another year in the same startup. But because they invested more than 90K total, they found themselves disqualified. You also can't be affiliated with the startup. So if you're, say, the brother of the CTO of a startup, that's a no-go for ESIC. A pro tip here. So if you're issuing investors safe notes or convertible notes, they're not actually eligible for ESIC until they actually vest, until they receive their shares. Because ESIC is all based on newly issued shares. Okay. So now we have to tell the ATO about what we're doing. Before that, we will give out our shares. We'll make sure that the employees have their the investor has their share certificates. We've lodged the relevant forms with ASIC, all before 30th of June. Then we have a month to basically tell the ATO through an ESIC investor report. And this is where we report the ATO key details such as the ABN, name and address, as well as more difficult things such as, say, the percentage of shares that they held after they got their shares. As an investor, we have to report this as well. The ATO necessarily isn't going to pick it all up. So there's a special section in your tax return at T9 where we include the amount of invested as well as the relevant offset that we think we're entitled to. Cool. So we've covered pretty dense topics to help both your employees and investors get on the cap table tax effectively. If you have any questions, by all means, reach out. You can Google Startup Accountants if you want, or Full Stack Advisory. Either will get you there. But thank you. You've been a good crowd. I'm just going to pass the mic over to my friend Doron now. So anyhow, big round of applause. Thank you. Oh.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks, Stuart. Ooh, that was loud. Sorry, everyone, for blowing your eardrums. That was fantastic, Stuart. So, Doron Shmilovits.
That's right.
I got it right.
You got it right.
Runs UX Law, a law firm which helps startups and entrepreneurs obtain legal advice for affordable fixed fees. His core service areas include commercial agreements, capital raising, IP and dispute resolution. And he helps clients of all sizes and in all industries.
That's it.
Take it away.
Thank you very much, Lana. Thank you for everyone for coming and for Freelancer for hosting us. I know you've just took a lot of content from Stuart, and that was an excellent presentation. I'll start off with a quick joke. What's the difference between a lawyer and an accountant? The accountant knows he's boring. So with that in mind, I'll have my very boring presentation now. So a little bit about us, and Lana kind of said it now. I started a firm which specializes in startups. Our idea is to give a bit of a different approach to many of the other law firms out there. We are targeted at startups and entrepreneurs. Practice areas are the main things that a founder deals with on a day-to-day basis. And we do things like fixed fees. We emphasize plain language advice with no jargon, and it's simple to follow. And we like to think of ourselves a bit more down to earth and more casual and more approachable. Shameless self-promotion aside, let's talk about sweat equity. So Stuart's already given a very good in-depth understanding of how sweat equity is given through ESOPs and employee share schemes. I'm going to do a little recap of that, and then we'll move forward. So basically, what is the concept of sweat equity? It's paying people with options or shares, a stake in your business, instead of just cash. Why do we do it? Two main reasons. First of all, it's pretty cheap. When you're a bootstrap startup, you might not be able to afford a CTO. The wages can be north of 200K. And also, it gives people skin in the game. And what I mean by that is that they're more aligned with the ideals of the business, and they're more incentivized to make sure that the business actually grows. How do we do it? So Stuart's spoken about the two main things that people do, which are employee share option plans and employee share schemes. Besides that, there's also what we call tailored vesting or equity agreements, as in sweat equity agreements. And I'll cover the difference between those two big categories in a moment. The last thing is, when do we do it? I say as soon as possible. The earlier you do it, the more you can play with in terms of how cheap you can issue the options at, and also the kind of taxation benefits that the employee can get and you can get. So get on it. Next, okay, so we have two main ways that we issue sweat equity. The first one is the ESOPs and the ESS, which is an actual regulated a regulated scheme that's mandated by the Corporations Act and the ATO. So there's a bunch of rules about how you do it and what are the principles that apply. But besides that, you can also do it just through a contract between you and the other party. And a lot of people just do it in a shareholders agreement of a startup or in a just normal agreement between two parties when they bring on a new co-founder. So I'll go through the differences and why do we use which one. So ESOP and ESS is used for small equity holders. We're talking about like your employees, your management team, maybe some advisors, maybe small corporate partners that are giving you some strategic importance for your business. The strength of it is that it's regulated by a government scheme which has its own benefits. It has taxation benefits, concessions, let's say. The agreement that you usually issue it under is a big standard company agreement, which usually means you hold all of the rights, you as in the startup. And it's easy to cancel it, it's easy to enforce things, you have a lot of flexibility. What are the weaknesses? Because it's a legal scheme regulated by law, it also means there's conditions. So Stuart went over quite a few of the conditions. There's maximum shareholding that you can have with it. There are minimum holding periods, so you usually can't get rid of the shares within the first 3 years. There's a couple of other things like that as well. We then have the vesting and sweat equity agreements. So as I said, this is a more flexible contract between you and maybe a new co-founder. You'd usually do it with like a CTO, maybe a PR agency, maybe it's a big sales team member. We use those for larger equity holders, right? So if you want to give someone 30% in your business, you can't do that through an ESOP or an ESS. So you have to do it in a tailored agreement. This one has a lot more flexibility in terms of how you can structure it, because it's just for one person. It doesn't have to apply to everyone. And but the weaknesses are, there's no tax concessions for it. And also, because it's not done through the Corporations Act, the law about it is less clear. It's a contract between you and someone else. There's a chance that one day after you try to exit in a certain way, the employee or the founder sues you for it, and then when you get up in front of a judge, the judge may tell you that he doesn't accept some of the things that you've written there. It's possible. That's what the lawyers are here for. We're meant to stop that happening, but it happens. Judges are crazy. Okay, so let's move on to what's a common example of the sweat equity that I come across, right? A startup comes up to me and says, I've given my developer 30% in order to build my app, build my website, whatever it is. That's the main one. That's what you always hear. They tell me there's no agreement about it, maybe a couple of emails, right? Very basic commercial terms are stated. So what I just said, 30% for an app. That's it. And the parties have a very limited history together. They don't know each other. They haven't been friends for 10 years. They haven't done a lot of business together. All of these things are really, really bad. They're really bad signs, and in my experience, they usually end in disaster. So what are the common problems? First of all, the terms are very vague. Because there's no agreement, it means we don't really know what's expected of someone. It's like saying, build me a house for 30%, right? The app can be a million things. There's deadlines sometimes, there's different milestones, there's so much that can go wrong. There's so much difference between usually what a business expects and what a service provider provides. And you see that in every relationship. It doesn't have to be a sweat equity relationship. You hire a contractor to do something, whether it's a software developer, whether it's a PR agency, whether it's someone to fix something in your house, half of the times it doesn't go according to plan. Change of circumstances. These things usually apply for a very long period of time. Things happen in the middle. People want to move away, people have a change of circumstance with family or friends, people want to move on to different jobs. The startup might go through all of changes. Startups change very, very quickly. The idea is to pivot and turn. Investment comes in. None of this is covered by the handshake agreement that we had, and that causes problems down the line. And the last one is poor performance, which I guess I've covered before to an extent. So I mean, so many times someone starts doing work for you and you just want to end it because it's terrible. But you have this very unclear agreement which doesn't really specify what happens if things are done halfway and if you're even allowed to terminate it. So what do we do about it? Basically, you get a really good lawyer, but let's go about it. Let's say what I would do about it, right? So first of all, you need a solid agreement that really gives you precise commercial terms. And what you want to go along with it is vesting conditions. So a nice schedule which shows you exactly what's expected of the service provider and exactly what he gets in return or she gets in return. And it comes on incrementally. You also want a defined number of options, not a percentage base. And I'll explain it further a bit later. Besides that, termination mechanics. And this is something that I actually want to emphasize for every single contract and every single relationship that you go along with. Termination grounds is the most important thing when you're running a business, when in terms of legal relationships. You got to always have the ability to exit a relationship quickly and make sure that there's no loose ends from it. So in this context, it's the ability to terminate both people that are good leavers and people that are bad leavers. And I'll explain in a minute what that means. Then we talk about exit provisions. I understand the termination of mechanics and exit provision probably sound similar, but a termination event is when you terminate the employee. An exit event is an exit event for your startup. So we're talking about a sale, we're talking about maybe a restructure, or a buyback of all of the options or shares. The last thing is the valuation methods. Stuart's spoken a bit about valuation methods. It's really important in your agreement for sweat equity to have agreed valuation methods so we can be able to buy back the shares, value the shares, know what we need to do in terms of tax obligations for minimum exercise price and discount prices. How does vesting usually work for options? So all of the options usually granted up front. That's what the document says. 200,000 options, let's say that. Usually, and this is the best approach, they're not vested at the beginning. Nothing is vested. The options vest over time, ideally tied to certain milestones. So long as an option is not vested, it's very easy to cancel. It's also not convertible into shares, which means it's not worth that much at the moment. Once options become vested, they're harder to cancel without compensation, and also they become convertible into shares. Some startups like to say that even after a share has vested, it cannot be exercised until a bit later down the track to separate even further, because they don't want people just randomly throughout the course of the business exercising shares and the cap table keeps changing. So they say to them, your options are vested, it means you have rights to them, it means we can't take them away without compensating you, but you can only exercise them on the next capital raise. Yeah. Buyback rights are done from the beginning. Has to be in the original document. And you can buy back usually at quite a few different points. And I'll go through buyback towards the end. And we're getting there, don't worry. Okay, so let's talk about some of those things that I was speaking about before. We're going to go a bit deeper into them. So the commercial terms, what do we need to do? Number one, everyone always wants to say 10% equity, 12% equity, 15%. This is not a good way of doing things because equity can change over time. Most of these vesting schemes go over 4 years. As I said, a lot happens in that time, including outside investment. You don't want someone to come on day one, or let's say, would be better to say on the first year, and then a bit later a big investment comes in, and after the investment they say, okay, well, I was promised 30% of the shares, and I never said 30% of the shares before the investments, it's 30% of the shares once I finish my milestones. So what you need to do is an exact number of options. You look at your cap table, you see you have, let's say, 10,000 shares, you want to give the person 10%, you don't write 10%, you write 1,000 options. If things change in the middle, your agreement should be able to cater for that, for restructures and for share reorganizations. The next thing, it's very, very common to just tie vesting just for as time passes. So each day you work, more options vest. This is not a great idea because there's no good incentive about it. A lot of people can just do nothing for a very long time. And because you would like to avoid conflict, you tend to wait a lot of time before you do something with bad employees. It happens a lot. What you really want is tie it as much as possible to measurable metrics. So my favorite would be actual tasks, milestones. So if you're a product manager or something like that, so it's, framework's done, bam, X amount vests. Then the next stage is done, another amount vests. It can also be financial metrics, right? So if it's a salesperson, it can be for a certain amount of sales, certain amount of referrals. If it's for a PR agency, it's after a certain amount of articles. So I usually like to do a mix of both time and measurable metrics tasks. I like to say subject to annual review as well. Again, because things change so much for a startup, a lot of the KPIs or the vesting scheme might not be relevant after a while, and you want to have that ability to just know that at the end of the year, you get to have that meeting and you get to decide whether things need to change. The last one is a cliff period, and the reason why I really like a cliff, I'll start by saying a cliff period is where there's an initial stage when nothing vests, and then it starts vesting. So let's say, for an example, a 1-year cliff means that in the first year, nothing vests. On the first anniversary, then maybe, let's say, a big chunk will vest, like 25%, and then we'll go from there. Why do we do that? Because usually during the first couple of months is when you get a good feel of whether this person is good or not, right? Very often, I know from my hiring, from other companies I've been in, they can usually start off very well in the first 2-3 weeks. After 2 months, they're just terrible, and you know that this has to end. So you want to give yourself a good safety net of, let's say, a year or 6 months or whatever it is, probationary period, right? So to really evaluate the person, and after you do that, you say, okay, now everything kicks into gear. Because don't forget, giving someone equity in your business is a big deal, right? It's not cash. It's not just something that goes and is fungible and moves around. It's equity in your business, and it means something. The next part I want to talk about is termination grounds. So, as you know, people leave. Stuart just said it. Takes you usually 7 to 10 years to exit. Software designers usually stick around for about 3 years, and many people below that as well. So we usually separate it into two tiers of how an employee can leave. Good and bad. Very simple. So good employees are people that just leave because they had to leave. You know, change of circumstance, another job offer. We left on good terms. Usually what we do with them is we say, okay, we look at where you are. Whatever's vested has vested, and you're entitled to that. Whatever hasn't vested is out the window, it's gone. Still, there's a big idea in startups, and especially in smaller companies, that you don't want someone who is not involved with your business day to day, unless they're an investor. I'm talking about sweat equity. You don't want someone who's no longer affiliated with the startup to have equity in the startup. And that's why we have a buyback mechanism. So on the good leaver mechanism, we say to the employee, you've done a great job. You have 1,000 vested options. They're worth something. We're going to value them now, and we're going to give you that compensation, if we can afford it. So that's usually what we do with that. And I would usually recommend most startups to do it that way. I would usually recommend to do a buyback if you can afford it. The bad leavers are the people that you terminate for poor performance, for behavioral issues, for abandoning the startup, for your screw-ups. So the idea with them is that we terminate them for cause. You've got to make sure you have good cause. It's just like terminating a normal employee. You can open a massive can of worms if you terminate someone in the wrong way. But in that case, we usually tell them everything is cancelled. All of the options are cancelled. All of the shares, if shares have been granted, can be bought back for basically no consideration, for nominal consideration. Obviously, it can trigger a backlash from the employee, which means, yeah.
Can you really do that if something's already been announced?
Yes. It has worked before, yeah. So it depends what you do. It doesn't have to be. It can be what you define in the contract. Yeah. So it's usually for summary terminations, and there has been acceptance for it in the courts. They have enforced it in the past. But similar to what I've said before, going up against the courts is a roll of the dice. So you don't know who's sitting up there and what they're going to decide today. At the end of the day, they look at what they think was fair. If the employee deserved to have all of their options or share cancelled, it may happen. And a lot of companies do it, including public companies. I've dealt with that quite a few times. The next part is exit events. So this is the fun stuff of the startup. Hooray, you did well. There's an exit event. Okay, so your first one is, a trade sale or an IPO. In that stage, a lot of companies have some flexibility in the agreement to say, wow, we did so well, we're going to actually reward our employees. Not all of your shares or options are vested, but we're going to accelerate them anyway, because we did so well, everyone should benefit. Another option is the buyback. So most of these agreements actually have a clause, and this is what you were asking before, that the startup is allowed to initiate its own buyback for no reason, so long as you pay for everything for the fair market value. This is really important sometimes because, let's say you do a deal with private equity sometimes, we did one last week, they are dealing with 3 founders at the moment, and they want to buy all of the shares. They don't want, the day before the sale goes through, for 100 employees to exercise their options, and now they need to sign agreements with 103 people instead of 3. And the people won't give the warranties that they want to give because they're just employees in the company. So sometimes the company says, okay, we know we have an exit event on the horizon. We need to get rid of all of these options. Let's pay them all out for fair market value based on the price that we're about to get. Once we do that, we can sell easily to the new buyer. The last one is a restructure. Sometimes the companies just have to move things around. New holding entity, moving assets, things change, share splits, things like that. So the structure of the company changes, and we need to change the options because of it. So again, this is one of the mechanisms that give us flexibility instead of just saying, you know, these are your options, that's what you get. Okay, valuation methods. So Stuart spoke about valuation methods through the safe harbor valuation methods. So the ATO came up with these provisions, and they really, really help startups because, as Stuart said, net tangible assets will almost always mean that your early stage startup is worth nothing. It's got no assets, right? So this allows us to issue shares for very, very cheap. We can do the exercise price as at 1 cent for the option. So you're essentially giving them for free almost. You can buy back the shares for really cheap as well. So if you have a problem with a bunch of employees, you say, okay, I'm buying it all back. Let's do a net tangible asset valuation. Company's worth nothing. I can buy the shares for nothing. I can buy the options for nothing. Controversial, but can happen if you're in a bind. The next type of way we do it is probably the more old school way of doing it and what most people did before the safe harbor valuation methods came in. It's an independent valuer. We hire an independent accountant or valuer. They come in, they look at everything, they value the shares. They don't just look at something like net tangible assets. They have to give consideration to what's happening out in the market sometimes. Maybe the most recent valuation of the company by an outside investor, someone who's actually contributed. And that's the fair market value of the options. The benefit of this is for the employees because they usually get a more balanced one. The problem with this is that you have to pay for it. It's usually time consuming as well. Usually what I see happen with these clauses is that it never actually goes through. Before that, they just agree something between them. The employee and the startup just agree something between them. The last one is what I call a balance sheet evaluation. Basically, in the agreement, the parties agree between them, all right, let's just agree that there's a certain way that we're going to evaluate according to the balance sheet, maybe slap on a 2.5 multiplier, 3 multiplier, 4, 5, whatever you want it to be. The parties agree to it up in advance, and because of it, it can be very cheap and quick and very binding because everyone's agreed to it already. So those are the valuation methods we use for buying back. So what does the buyback process usually look like? Options are issued at the beginning. They're subject to vesting. Options and shares vest over time. At one point, the employee leaves. The company has to sit and look, okay, were they a good leaver or a bad leaver? Let's make a determination. Let's say they're a good leaver for the purpose of this. So let's calculate the fair market value of the vested options. We have to look how much vested options they have. We calculate the fair market value. Then we issue them buyback documents, so saying we're now exercising our right to buy back. Usually you have in your documents that you've prepared what's called a power of attorney. This is a document that allows you to pretty much compel the transaction. And you're allowed to do that because the employee has given you the right to sign documents in their name. So you take a share transfer, or whatever it is, a buyback form, you sign for the startup, you sign for the employee person to your power of attorney, and then you pay, and it's all done. You cancel them. This is it for me today. I hope you've had a fantastic time. If you have any questions, I'll be around just now. And if anyone else needs any, we're about to have a panel right this second, so let's just save it for that. And if anyone needs any other advice, we can help with a lot of things. That's it.
Thanks, Doron. Wow, thank God we have specialists who can absorb all of that information so we don't have to remember that. So we have a Q&A now. I'm going to bring Stuart and Doron back up on stage. You are welcome to grab a chair or sit, enjoy. So does anyone have some questions on the floor? We have a catch box so everyone can hear your question.
Feel free to throw it to me.
And yeah, you can throw this around. Don't worry about it.
Is it? It's
We can
on?
hear you.
Okay. My question is around that share. I'm working in a startup and grant a share, but I need to wait for 1 year, and then I can buy that share, that amount of share for $1. When I need to report to ATO that I have something, is it now or after 1 year?
So this is a tax question.
Yeah. So you'd be wanting to report something when you sell the shares. Right?
Oh, when I sell the share,
Yeah.
not when I buy that share for $1 next year.
Yeah, it's not for when you purchase things. It's for when you sell. Yeah,
Oh,
like the whole definition of a CGT event is when you dispose of an asset to another party. If you're buying something.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And then vested term is happen when I buy the share, right? When you use the terminology vested.
Vesting.
No.
Yeah, so I'll take this one. So vesting is not actually related to taxation from this point of view. I mean, vesting is pretty much, it's an agreement between two parties when that share can be exercised or sold or depending on what they've agreed between them. So let's say an option, the option is given to you, and until it's vested, you're not allowed to exercise it.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
This isn't, we didn't kind of cover this, but I'm interested in, we talked about employee share schemes, and let's just say amongst founders, are there like different classes of shares that you can have, like founder shares with more voting or voting rights or something like that you can have, so that let's just say you're going to or you want to offer somebody else and bring them on board as a co-founder, but as let's just say the main founder, you don't want to lose too much control or whatever it is. How do you deal with that kind of stuff? Maybe it's off topic, but
No, that's all right. Look, pretty much in your company constitution, it says what shares are available. It might have like Class A, Class B, Class C, founder shares, management shares, preference shares.
Yeah.
So you just issue a certain type of shares. And in the constitution, when you start or later down the track, you can specify what those shares give you. So it might be extra voting rights, it might be no voting rights, it might be the first preference when the company is liquidated for distribution of the assets. There's a lot of those things.
yeah, because I think like Facebook and Google and the founders of those did that kind of stuff with. Do you know much about whether when you go to get investors, whether how they see those types of things? Are they cool with it, or?
Look, my experience is this. Australia is very much an ordinary share place. Everyone just has ordinary shares. They don't play around with a lot of different share classes. This is most of what's happening, and the ATO and the government is trying to push that as well. So as Stuart said earlier today, you can't issue any other shares except for ordinary shares in an ESOP. They're not eligible for any of the treatments unless they're ordinary shares. In terms of what will investors say, look, it depends from investor to investor. Most of them will want voting shares because they want the ability to have some sort of decision-making power in the company. From time to time, when you meet angels, when you meet family, friends, and fools, you can get away with giving non-voting shares. What's your experience?
Yeah, for ESOPs, you want it all to be ordinary, and I don't see so much founder shares or many other different varieties, at least at the early stage. If they have, they've been well advised.
So do ordinary shares have full voting rights?
So yeah, an ordinary shares means one vote per share, normal right to dividends, normal right to distribution of assets on liquidation.
So I'll just continue with the same question. Sorry if I'm going out of scope of this discussion. Say you start a company, say you initially valid like it's like 1 million and you pool in the resources from your friends and family, and after that, like maybe after a couple of years, an investor comes in, you need to pull in more resources, like you need to expand like 5 million or something. So you have already a structure, like maybe like founder will take around 60% and family and friends will have 30 or 40%. You have a structure there. And suddenly the investor comes in with a huge amount of money. So how is the shares being allocated to the founder? How do you do that? Like the rights of different kinds of shares that can you expand the whole.
Yeah. So everyone gets diluted down. So you decide what the pre-money valuation of your company is. So let's say the company is worth $1 million. And if someone comes and gives 500K, then they are now the value of the company after that becomes $1.5 million, right? And they get shares based on that. So what's 500 plus? Yeah, so that's 33% in the company. That's what they'll get.
So
because there was $1 million, and then they added 500K. So they've put in 500K out of 1.5, right?
Okay.
So they have 33%, and everyone gets diluted equally.
So the founders, the share will come down like less than 50, 30.
So each founder, each original shareholder is diluted down 33%. So because there's a new 33% holder, so everyone's got to go down 33%. So someone that's had, if someone had 100% of the company, they now have 66, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
So in practice, how do you see, like in most of the startups, like the founder retains more than 50% of the shares, or how is it like? Because it's always a bargain.
Depends when. At the beginning, everyone has a lot. What do you think? Afterwards, it goes down.
Yeah, I like for a lot of people, a lot of startups do financial modelling. I like to do cap table modelling. So where do you want your percentage to be after each successive raise? Like, Mark Zuckerberg, he's like, hovering around 20-25%. But he has super voting shares, so he can still sway Facebook wherever he dictates, right? But he would have had this plan all this way back at the beginning. So it's just foresight, planning.
Yeah, it's one of those things. It's how long's a piece of string. It also depends a lot on your negotiating power, right? If you're desperate for cash, you'll take a worse deal, right? And if you're a startup that everyone wants to invest in and there's 8 people knocking on the door, then you shop around for what's the best deal and you can say no to people. Yeah.
With the percentage that you give to ESOP when you structure the company, I saw in the slides it says 10%, but that's 10% as dictated by the ATO and whatever the regulations and all of that. But are you finding that that's what that startups are normally doing, or is it used to be 20% from what I recollect before, but since the regulations have come, I don't know when, 3 years ago, whatever, it seems to be 10% and it's reduced?
Yeah, I'm seeing less than 10% per, and often much less than 10% actually, for employees other than the initial founder circle. Yeah. Right.
So if it's 10, so 90% is kept for the founders and all of that, founders and maybe others, but
it's 10% per employee. So you might give it to say 3 senior executives who aren't the original founders, and collectively they may add up to say 25%.
So to clarify, you're allowed to have more than 10% of your ESOP allocated. It just can't be one person with over 10%. So no one is allowed to hold over 10% in ESOP shares. But you can have 15%, you can even have 30%, some people do it. I think what I've seen is it hovers between 10 to 15 in what they plan to give away. But again, this is it's a fluid concept because they say like, okay, we'll give 15 away, but they don't always find everyone, or, they are still looking to reserve some of it. It's a fluid concept.
So it's per person. So I can give 3 employees, as you were just saying there, and therefore I would give 10% per, and it would be 30% of the company.
Yeah, you can do that.
Right. Okay. My thinking was slightly different, actually, that down the line I would have 100 odd employees and I would keep 10% of this of my company for these 100 odd employees, which would be options that you would multiply, have a multiplication factor.
Yeah, that's correct. That's what most people do. So
Yeah.
most people say, I'm going to look at my cap table in a way that 10% is always reserved to employees.
Yeah.
And it says it in the shareholders agreement. And as the company grows, because of that clause in the shareholders agreement, then we can keep adding a bit more to the option plan to always keep it at 10%. There's even some investors that insist on having 10% reserved for the ESOP.
Yes. So then how does that play with what you've just discussed, that each employee gets 10%? How is that working?
That's outside the.
Yeah, some people do 30. Some people do more.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, 10%, 10 to 15% is the average allocation for this option pool, which you'll find on Google.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
Just jumping in for a sec. So, hi. So what do you think is some of the biggest mistakes that founders make with an ESOP?
Do you want to start?
With a bit more of a generic question.
Yeah, I think that they're not actually considering about the things that they have to report to the government bodies. And we just had an instance last week where an employee, they got into an ESOP, but the founders weren't actually giving them anything to report to the ATO. So they were left in a whole bind in terms of how much taxable income do I have to declare in this capital gains. They didn't know. Now, they've already left the company. The relationship has kind of been severed, and it's kind of hard to recover this critical piece of data to work out your tax. So that's what a lot of founders are just missing or neglecting.
Yeah, and for me, besides that, which I've actually seen a lot of, most of the things that I went through in the presentation, which is people not really having any sort of like a precise agreement of what's allowed and what's not allowed, and it's kind of all very much up in the air. And then you get a break in the relationship and a big misunderstanding about what was meant to be delivered and what is being returned. And then you start to get really bad things like, you know, someone was doing it all for equity. They were doing an app for just equity options. And then when they decided to walk away because they found a better job, they're like, okay, well, I no longer want the options. I've worked X amount of hours. My hourly rate would have been X amount, so you now owe me $68,000. Do you know what I mean? And because there's nothing in writing, nothing in place, then it's all up in the air. And I mean, who wants to go to court for like unpaid wages? That's like one of the worst claims to defend against under the Fair Work Act. Like it's a nightmare, and most like employment law firms take those on a free because they do like no win, no fee, because they know they'll win something because the legislation's so biased towards the employee. So the founder's in a really, really bad place. They didn't plan anything, and now they basically have an employee saying, hey, I've worked for you for 8 months and you haven't paid me a cent. So yes, there was some handshake agreement before, but it's a bad place to be in. Sorry, there's just someone there.
So just with regards to like termination clauses and things like that. Cheers, mate. Thanks. Just in regards to like termination clauses, how complex do you find they need to be? And in your experience, what are some common causes that, you know, those termination clauses are triggered from ESOPs?
So it actually works on 2 levels. In the ESOP, you usually just have a clause that says they're a bad leaver if they've been terminated for cause under their employment agreement. So you refer it to a separate agreement. In that agreement, in your normal employment agreement, you should have a very wide termination clause for what is termination for cause. Sometimes it's like, there's like 10 sub-clauses of it. It's usually things like, you know, not showing up to work a couple of times, theft, fraud, misuse of company IP or confidential information, just to rattle a couple of those off. Breach of the restraint, so like the non-compete clauses. So yeah, a couple of those. Got one here.
This is, Doron, probably more to do with the performance stuff that you put in let's just say, an agreement. Sometimes that's not clear, and like in a startup at the beginning, job descriptions change, you wear many hats.
I know.
How do you foresee, like, yeah.
Yeah, look, it's a battle that I have with my clients every single time we do this. They always come with very generic descriptions, and I always tell them that I don't think it's good enough. Look, a good way to do it is to just define a scope of what you are meant to do, and then if things are outside the scope, then it might result in extra options being granted. And as I said, everything is subject to review every year. So if we say something like a head of sales and we have sales targets for them to meet, maybe a minimum hours of work a day for the startup. It might be like certain partnerships that they manage to secure, and we work off those. And if things need to be changed, we can usually change it by agreement of the employees or wait until the end of the year.
I'll jump in with one more question. How closely is the ATO reviewing the ESIC status? Can any startup get the status?
Yeah, so it's mainly for the more prominent startups that are getting funded by VCs. There's a lot more capital on the table. There's a lot more people trying to get the ESIC. So there's a lot more table, for the ATO to recover when auditing these ESICs. And we've actually seen quite a few, not our clients particularly, but other firms, they're getting their ESIC status revoked. There's a whole refund of cash, mainly because they were perhaps a bit too lenient on the principles that they applied for. So it's always good due diligence to get that private ruling done. That way you have a bit more confidence with the ATO around what position they'll take on your ESIC status.
Before you mentioned part of the status thing, looked like if you'd gone for an R&D tax concession or something like that, some of the criteria kind of look quite similar to what you would need to prove about innovation and scalable and bigger market and all that kind of stuff. So if you're getting that, again, you're applying its self thing, the ATO can desk audit it or whatever it is.
It's self-assessed.
Yeah, self-assessed, sorry.
Yeah, so most of the startups that we're working with, if they're getting the R&D, they've usually got one of these other pieces of criteria to get across the line. A patent, an accelerator holding, a third-party investment.
And with that, don't IT companies sometimes find it a little bit difficult to kind of prove like some of the things to be entitled for the R&D? Is that something that you find harder to? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, there's a lot of.
There's a criteria. Like if you're doing manufacturing or something, it might be a little bit easier. But for IT,
there's a lot of heat around the R&D at the moment. I think there's 1.4 million extra allocated to the R&D in terms of auditing the R&D. So if you're a software startup, I'd just say handle with care. Make sure that you've got a conservative R&D consultant on your side giving you the tick of approval, as there's a lot of cowboys out there saying that, we'll take your money, we'll process your claim. But the reality is the bee will sting 2 or 3 years later, right, when the audit gets done. So, choose your R&D consultant with care.